Welcome back. This is section 8 on this series on the Bible. I began this presentation back in tape 1 by asking the question, if you had met Jesus 2,000 years ago, do you think that you would have recognized him as the Messiah? Now consider that the people of his hometown didn't, the people of Israel didn't, the people of Jerusalem didn't, the Jewish religious experts didn't. They didn't recognize him as the Messiah. Why? Why not? It's because to all outward appearances, Jesus did not fulfill any of their messianic expectations. Jesus didn't come with an army. He didn't come as a conqueror to drive the Roman Empire out of Israel, as explicitly foretold in the prophecies. Now, Jesus frequently disagreed with the highly respected religious experts. And Jesus even called the Jewish rabbis blind leaders of the blind. At the end of his life, when Jesus was killed, he was hung on a tree. An act which in the Old Testament says that anyone who is executed and hung on a tree is under God's curse. So how could the Messiah be under God's curse? But the most difficult prophecy to explain away was the Jewish expectation that Elijah would return, quote, from heaven, unquote, before the Christ appears. Now, as far as anyone could see, none of these things had happened. So how could Jesus be the Messiah? Now, we know from the Baha'i writings that Jesus truly was the Messiah, and it has been clearly explained in all instances that Jesus did fulfill the messianic prophecies. However, he did not fulfill them literally. He did not fulfill them in a fleshly manner. Now, Jesus was the Messiah, but the prophecies were fulfilled in a way that the people of his day were not prepared to recognize. The prophecies were fulfilled spiritually. Now, the Jewish people had been misled by the false interpretations of their religious leaders. And because of this, they had failed to recognize Jesus as the Messiah. Now, the question then can be asked, if you had been there 2,000 years ago, do you think that you would have interpreted these prophecies any differently? And do you think that you would have recognized Jesus as the Messiah from these prophecies? Now, if you had never met Jesus before, and if all that you knew about him was the things that were told to you by the Jewish religious leaders of that day, would you have recognized Jesus as the Messiah? It would have been difficult. Now, if the Jewish people of 2,000 years ago had misinterpreted their prophecies, and if they expected a literal fulfillment of their prophecies, if they were expecting to see Elijah physically come sailing down out of heaven to help the Messiah and his army to drive the Romans out of Israel, and if their literal expectations and interpretations were wrong, then what about the Christians and the people of today who likewise expect the literal fulfillment of their messianic prophecies and who expect to see Jesus physically descend from heaven? Now, if the literal interpretations were wrong 2,000 years ago, then why wouldn't they also be wrong today? And that is the point of this presentation. Jesus, Peter, Paul, and the other apostles clearly warned and predicted that Christians in these last days, like their Jewish counterparts of 2,000 years ago, they predicted that the Christians would also become what Jesus called, quote, deceived, unquote, by false teachers. Now, I've already shown that Peter warned that false teachers would import destructive heresies into Christianity, and that they would gain many followers, and that because of these false teachings, Jesus' true, quote, way, or his true path, would actually be, as what Peter called, it would actually be abandoned. Then, in the next part, we did, as Paul suggested in 2 Corinthians 13. Paul said to, quote, examine yourselves to see if you are still in the faith. Test yourselves. So we begin to test ourselves to see how closely modern Christian beliefs and how closely the beliefs of the people today follow the orthodox teachings of Peter and Paul. As you know, Peter was given the keys of the kingdom by Jesus, and Jesus said that Peter would be the foundation of his church. And Paul was the only one in Peter's writings who was endorsed, who was approved, who was unlocked, if you will. We then saw, concerning interpretation, that Peter and Paul's method of interpretation always emphasized the spiritual. Paul told us, I speak of spiritual things in spiritual words. That those people who don't have Paul's spiritual perspective, those who don't interpret Paul's teaching spiritually in terms of their spiritual content, these people won't understand what Paul was saying. And Paul closed his statement by telling us that his teachings must be, quote, spiritually discerned, unquote. They must be spiritually interpreted. Now, Paul then gave us some examples of what he meant by spiritual interpretation. Paul said that the Jewish initiation rite of circumcision, for example, that it was an inner spiritual reality of the heart and had nothing to do with the flesh. Now, continuing, Paul said concerning the Jewish food taboos, the kosher laws, Paul told us that God doesn't care what people eat, as long as these practices and as long as our actions don't offend others. Paul continues by telling us concerning Jewish festivals and Sabbaths and such days, he told us that all days should be considered special and that all days should be set aside to honor God and to earnestly study God's scriptures. And then moving on to the fundamental Christian teachings, Peter and Paul clearly told us that resurrection was in the Spirit. That at death we are changed. That we have to give up our fleshly, earthly, physical bodies before we go to be with the Lord in heaven in the Spirit. Now, Paul taught that when Jesus died, he became, quote, a life-giving spirit. And we saw that Peter taught that when Jesus died, he, quote, died in the flesh and was raised in the Spirit, unquote. Nowhere in Peter or Paul's teachings does it say that Jesus or anyone else was resurrected in the flesh. In all instances, Peter and Paul teach that Jesus' resurrection was, quote, in spirit, unquote. Now likewise, Jesus' ascension into heaven, when he ascended into heaven and when he sits at the right hand of the Father was also, quote, in spirit. We know from the New Testament text that God is an invisible spirit. And we learned that when Jesus was killed, he became a life-giving spirit. God is an invisible spirit, and that after Jesus' death, as Paul said, Jesus became a life-giving spirit. And we also saw where Paul said that flesh and blood can't go to heaven. Flesh and blood can't go to God's invisible spiritual realm. Now these are the teachings which were given to us by Peter and Paul. These are the correct, or in the Greek, the orthodox Christian teachings that were given to us by Peter and Paul. And as we know, Peter and Paul were the endorsed, the approved, the orthodox teachers. And then finally I showed that in all instances in the past, that whenever a prophet of God returned from heaven, it was always in the Spirit. It was always in the Spirit. Elijah returned from heaven in, quote, spirit and power, unquote, as John the Baptist. And Jesus said that he came down from heaven 2,000 years ago. And he explained to us that it was in the Spirit, not in the flesh. Now, we have also seen from history that whenever God has sent a prophet or a manifestation to humanity in the past, they have always come, as Isaiah said, "Unto us a child is born." The prophets were all born as children. They all had mothers. They all grew up. And all of them, at a certain point in their lives, began to tell us that they had a message from God to give to us. Now, sadly enough, history also tells us that this message usually was rejected at first by the people. And only gradually later did the people begin to wake up to the fact that the message actually was from God. In the past, this has been the treatment of Abraham, Joseph, Moses, the Hebrew prophets, and Jesus too after he appeared. Now back to the original subject. Not one prophet of God has literally descended from heaven in the past. So what about the prophecies of the Messiah who is to appear after Jesus? The coming of the Son of Man. And Jesus gave prophecies concerning his appearance. But Jesus also warned in his parable of the thief in the night, and in his parable of the 10 virgins, that recognizing the Son of Man in the last days will not be any easier than it was in the past. It's always been difficult in the past. And Jesus warned us that when the Son of Man comes, recognizing him will not be any easier. After that, we looked at the prophecies foretelling the coming of the Son of Man. And we saw that in the 70-week prophecy of Daniel, that this prophecy foretold the coming of Jesus the Messiah hundreds of years before he appeared. And we also saw that this prophecy accurately foretold Jesus' sacrificial death. And then in the abomination of desolation prophecy, also found in Daniel, the one referred to by Jesus as the prophecy which foretells his return, the 2300-year prophecy predicts the coming of the Son of Man in 1844 of the Christian calendar, 1844 AD. We then saw that the book of Revelation and the book of Daniel both contain 1260-year prophecies. There are 7 1260-year prophecies in the book of Revelation, and there are 2 1260-year prophecies in the book of Daniel. That's a total of 9 1260-year prophecies. It was demonstrated that this prophecy refers to certain destructive events which occurred within the religion of Islam at the very beginning of Islam. And that the 1200-year prophecy, 1260-year prophecy, indicates the year 1260 of the Islamic calendar, which coincidentally happens to be the year 1844 of the Christian calendar. So we can begin to see that the prophecies of the holy books all converge repeatedly upon the year 1844. In Moses' 7-time prophecy, 7 times 7 years equals 2,520 days, and the 2,520 days actually equals 2,520 years. It was shown that this prophecy also indicated the year 1844. So what actually happened in 1844? Were the prophecies right, or were they mistaken? Now, Baha'is know that 1844 was the year when the prophecies actually were fulfilled. And 1844 is the year when the long-awaited Promised One actually did appear. 1844 is the year when the Baha'i faith began. And here's the story. On May 23rd, 1844, a young merchant from Shiraz, Persia, quietly announced to his first disciple that he was a prophet of God. He assumed the title of the Bab, which in English means the gate. And he proclaimed, quote, I am the promised one. I am the one whose name you have for 1,000 years invoked, at whose mention you have risen, whose advent you have longed to witness, and the hour of whose revelation you have prayed God to hasten. Now Jesus, as we know, had a very short ministry. And likewise, the Bab only taught for 6 short years. Now the Bab's teachings attracted tens of thousands of followers, from the most humble, uneducated servants to the most preeminent religious experts in the entire country. As his fame grew, the Bab's teachings and his life aroused the hatred of the fanatical Islamic clergy and government leaders of his homeland. The Bab was arrested, he was beaten, and he was imprisoned in 2 separate remote mountain fortresses. However, we know that nothing his enemies could do could stop him, or could stop the spread of his new religion. So finally, the Bab's enemies decided to make an example of him. They took him to a public square, and using ropes, they suspended him above the ground. And the Bab and one of his followers who had begged to die with him faced a firing squad of 750 soldiers. Now the Bab, as he was being taken out, told these people that nothing that they could do would stop him, that nothing they could do would harm him until his mission was complete. Well, 10,000 witnesses saw the Bab and his young follower disappear in the dense smoke as the 750 rifles fired upon him. And when the smoke cleared, the Bab was gone. They searched for him, and he was found unharmed back in his jail cell, calmly dictating his final instructions to his secretary. Later on, when the Bab indicated that he was finished with his earthly tasks, and that he was now ready to sacrifice his life, the Bab was taken out again, and this time a different regiment of 750 soldiers had to be brought in, and this time he was shot and killed. Now, the Bab and before he was killed, the Bab repeatedly and emphatically stated that he was the gate through which an even greater teacher from God would soon appear. In one place the Bab said, quote, Well is it with him who fixeth his gaze upon the order of Baha'u'llah, and rendereth thanks unto his Lord, for he will assuredly be made manifest. God hath irrevocably ordained it. Unquote. Now the Bab never met Baha'u'llah, but one of the first acts of the Bab's mission, at the very beginning of his ministry, was to send his first disciple to the Persian city of Tehran. Now the Bab instructed his disciple, quote, A secret lies hidden in that city. When made manifest, it shall turn the earth into paradise. My hope is that you may partake of its grace and recognize its splendor. Unquote. This disciple journeyed to the city of Tehran, where he found Baha'u'llah. The Bab willingly sacrificed his life to prepare the way for the coming of Baha'u'llah. Now, Baha'u'llah, as you may know, is the name of the founder of the Baha'i faith. Baha'u'llah is the great teacher whose coming was foretold by the Bab. Baha'u'llah fulfills prophecies from all the holy books of the world's religions. And Baha'u'llah is the promised one. Baha'u'llah proclaimed, quote, "The time foreordained unto the peoples and kindreds of the earth is now come. The promises of God, as recorded in the Holy Scriptures, have all been fulfilled." Unquote. In another place, Baha'u'llah said, quote, "Verily I say, this is the day in which mankind can behold the face and hear the voice of the Promised One. The call of God hath been raised, and the light of his countenance hath been lifted up upon men. It behoveth every man to blot out the trace of every idle word from the tablet of his heart, and to gaze with an open and unbiased mind on the signs of his revelation, the proofs of his mission, and the tokens of his glory." And this is all Baha'is are asking you to do. To blot out the trace of every idle word from the tablet of your heart, and to gaze with an open and unbiased mind on the signs of Baha'u'llah's revelation, the proofs of Baha'u'llah's mission, and the tokens of its glory, and to decide whether you think Baha'u'llah truly is sent by God. In another place, to the followers of Jesus Christ, Baha'u'llah wrote, quote, "If ye be intent on crucifying again Jesus the Spirit of God, put me to death, for he hath once more in my person been made manifest unto you." Baha'u'llah claims to be the return of Christ. Now, Baha'u'llah fulfills more prophecies than Abraham, Moses, Jesus, Muhammad, and all the other prophets combined. Baha'u'llah is the promised one, and the proof of his claims can be clearly established. Now, the only problem is that within our limited space and time here, it's difficult to list all the prophecies. So, probably the most explicit prophecies foretelling the appearance of Baha'u'llah can be found in the Old Testament book of Isaiah. So I'm going to dwell primarily on the book of Isaiah. Now, the book of Isaiah, about 100 years before Christ was born, a reclusive Jewish religious sect hid their sacred writings in a cave near the Dead Sea in Israel. Now, no one knows exactly why they did this, but in the 1940s, these scrolls, which are known to us today as the Dead Sea Scrolls, these scrolls were rediscovered after being hidden in this cave for at least 2,100 years. Now, among these Dead Sea Scrolls was a complete copy of the book of Isaiah. Now, the Isaiah scroll found in the Dead Sea Scrolls was almost 1,000 years older than any of the other previously known versions of Isaiah. And when modern scholars compared the Dead Sea Scrolls version of Isaiah to modern copies of the same book, they were pleased to discover that the two are virtually identical. And this means that the book of Isaiah has remained essentially unchanged for at least 20 centuries. Now, the book of Isaiah was written approximately 2,600 years ago in Israel. And it is considered to be one of the most outstanding books of prophecy in the entire Bible. And in this book, Isaiah tells the story of the coming of the Messiah of the last days. Isaiah foretells the coming of Baha'u'llah. Now, the following section contains a summary of some of the more prominent messianic themes found in the book of Isaiah. Now, just as Jesus and Peter and Paul, Isaiah too tells us that when the Messiah appears in the last days, God's people will once again have fallen asleep and become blind. Once again, they will have, quote, fallen away from the true path and been led into the ditch. As Isaiah says, quote, "The Lord hath poured out upon you the spirit of deep sleep, and hath closed the eyes of the prophets, and your rulers. And the vision of all is become unto you as the words of a book that is sealed. Isaiah 29. So this is the description of the people of the last days when the Messiah appears. Their eyes have been closed in a deep sleep, and the book is like a book that has become sealed. These are the same words that Jesus and Paul used to describe the people of the last days. Jesus and Paul were right. This is what the people of their day were like. And Isaiah also tells us that these statements also apply to the people of the last days, those who live at the time when the Jews returned to Israel. Isaiah continues. He says that it shall come to pass in the last days that the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established, and all nations shall flow unto it. Isaiah 2:2. Isaiah continues by identifying the Messiah's family line. He wrote, quote, there shall come forth a rod out of the stem of Jesse, and the Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him, and the Spirit of wisdom and understanding. With righteousness shall he judge. In other words, Isaiah is saying that the Messiah will come from the family line of Jesse. And Jesse was the father of King David. Now we know from the genealogy of Baha'u'llah that Baha'u'llah is descended from the Persian kings. And if you remember, this is a prophecy of Zoroaster, that in the 12th century, after the beginning of the religion of the Arabian, God would raise up a prophet from the family line of the Persian kings. Well, Baha'u'llah is a descendant of the Persian kings, and he does fulfill the prophecy. Baha'u'llah's family line can be traced all the way back to the glory days of the Persian Empire, back to Cyrus the Great. And Cyrus's son was Sasan. His name was Sasan. And in the histories of the Middle East, we learned that the wife of Sasan was Rahab, who was a Jewish woman. We also learned that Rahab was the sister of Zorobabel. And if we look at the genealogy of Jesus found in the New Testament, we see that Jesus too is descended from Zorobabel. So this is where the genealogies meet. Baha'u'llah's family and Jesus' family were the same family. From Zorobabel, the genealogy can be traced back to the kings of ancient Israel, to Solomon, to David, to Jesse. And from there, it can be traced back to Abraham. So Baha'u'llah very literally fulfills the prophecy. Now, in the same chapter, Isaiah continues by describing one of the events which will announce the coming of the Messiah. Isaiah wrote, quote, it shall come to pass in that day that the Lord shall set his hand again, the second time, to recover the remnant of his people, and shall assemble the outcasts of Israel, and gather together the dispersed of Judah from the four corners of the earth. This is Isaiah 11. In other words, the Messiah will appear, and this is the time that we'll see the gradual return of the dispersed Jews back to the homeland of Israel. And we've talked about this in more detail in previous chapters, that this is one of the prophecies, the 1260-year prophecies, about the return of the Jews beginning to return in the year 1844, when the Edict of Toleration was signed. Once again, this is the time when Baha'u'llah appeared, and this is the time when the Jews began to return to Israel. Isaiah continues by telling us that the glory of God is going to come to Israel from the east. Isaiah wrote, the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see. This is in Isaiah 40. Then he says, God raised up the righteous man from the east, called him to his foot, gave the nations before him, and made him rule over kings. This is Isaiah 41. And Isaiah continues, I am God, calling a ravenous bird from the east, the man who executeth my judgment from a far country. This is Isaiah 46. Now, similar statements can also be found elsewhere in the Bible. For example, in Ezekiel 43 it says, quote, the glory of the God of Israel came from the way of the east, and the glory of the Lord came into the house by the way of the gate, whose prospect is toward the east." Unquote. The glory of God will come to Israel from the east by way of the gate. As you know, Baha'u'llah's name in English is translated the glory of God. And Baha'u'llah came to Israel from the east, and Baha'u'llah's forerunner was named the Bab, which means the gate. So the glory of God came to Israel from the east by way of the gate. Now Isaiah next says that when the Messiah comes, he will come with a new name. In the past, when the Jews were looking for the return of Elijah, they expected the same person who had disappeared into heaven 800 years earlier to return. And they apparently also expected his name to be Elijah and not John. Isaiah tells us that the same thing is true for the Messiah who will appear in the last days. Isaiah wrote, quote, "I will give them an everlasting name that shall not be cut off." Isaiah 56. And he continues, quote, "Thou shalt be called by a new name, which the mouth of the Lord shall name." Isaiah 62. And again he warned, quote, "Ye shall leave your name for a curse unto my chosen, for the Lord God shall slay thee, and call his people, call his servants by another name." God will call his servants by another name, and he will give us a new name. This last quote was from Isaiah 65. Now, many Christians have concluded that the new name mentioned here in Isaiah was Jesus. Now, this very possibly might have been true if it wasn't for the fact that Jesus also promised that he will have a new name when he returns. Jesus promised, quote, "Him that overcometh, I will write upon him the name of my God, and the name of the city of my God, which is New Jerusalem, which cometh down of heaven from my God, and I will write upon him my new name." Revelation 3:12. Jesus says, "I will write upon him that overcomes, I will write upon him my new name." Now Jesus also repeats this promise of a new name 2 other times in the book of Revelation, and I'm really not going to get into that too much here. It's found in Revelation 2 and Revelation 19. Now next, Isaiah continues by telling us where the Messiah will appear when he comes. He will come from the east, and Isaiah tells us where he will appear. Isaiah wrote, quote, "The excellency of Carmel and Sharon, they shall see the glory of the Lord, and the ransomed of the Lord shall return." The Jews will return, and Carmel, Mount Carmel, and the plain of Sharon will see the glory of the Lord. This is found in Isaiah 35. As you know, Baha'u'llah's name means the glory of the Lord. He came to Israel from the east at the time when the Jews began to return to Israel, and he appeared on Mount Carmel and Sharon. Once again, Baha'u'llah very clearly fulfills the prophecy. In another place, Isaiah adds, quote, "Sharon will be a fold of flocks, and the valley of Achor a place for the herds to lie down in for my people that have sought me." Isaiah 65. Now in these 2 passages, Isaiah has described a very specific area of Israel. He says that the glory of God will see Carmel, Sharon, and Achor. Now the city, which was known in ancient times as Achor, today is called Akka. And the city of Akka is located at the foot of Mount Carmel in Israel. And both Akka and Mount Carmel are situated on the plain of Sharon. So as you can see, Isaiah was very specific about where the Messiah will appear. And Baha'u'llah very literally fulfills this prophecy. Now there are other references in other places to the Messiah coming to Mount Carmel. For example, in the book of Isaiah, referring to the Messiah, it says that in that day he shall dwell solitarily in the wood in the midst of Carmel. This is found in Micah 7:12. Now the prophecy found in Micah 7:12 is one of the most specific prophecies in the book also. The terminology of Micah is very similar to the terminology found in the book of Isaiah. And in 7:12, Micah says, quote, "In that day also he shall come unto thee from Assyria." And as you know, Assyria was to the east of Israel. "And he will come from the fortified cities, and from the fortress even to the river, and from sea to sea, and from mountain to mountain. Notwithstanding, the land shall be desolate because of them that dwell therein, for the fruit of their doings." The land will be desolate because of the people there. And it says, "Feed thy people with thy rod, the flock of thine heritage, which dwell solitarily in the wood, in the midst of Carmel. According to the days of thy coming out of the land of Egypt, I will show unto him marvelous things." Now, as you probably know, when Baha'u'llah began to teach, he was opposed. He was imprisoned, and he was eventually exiled from place to place. And it says here in Micah that in that day he should come unto thee from Assyria. Did Baha'u'llah do that? Yes, he did. He will come from the fortified cities. Did he do that? Yes, he did. Fortified cities in Baghdad. Baha'u'llah was next exiled to Constantinople, which is also a fortified city, and then he was exiled to Akka, at the foot of Mount Carmel, and that too was a fortified city. He eventually went from the fortress of Akka to the river, as foretold by Micah, where Micah says, quote, "And from the fortress to the river." Baha'u'llah was exiled from sea to sea. He went from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean Sea, and from mountain to mountain. He was exiled from the mountains of Iraq to Mount Carmel in Israel. It says, "Feed thy people with thy rod." In the Bible, a rod is teachings. "The flock of thine heritage." Baha'u'llah's heritage is the prophets of old. He's a direct descendant of Abraham. "Which dwell in the wood in the midst of Carmel." There you go. He was in the wood of Carmel. He once pitched his tent on the side of Mount Carmel. And it says, "According to the days of thy coming out of the land of Egypt, I will show unto him marvelous things." Now the coming out of the land of Egypt took 40 years. And it says here that God will show him marvelous things for a time equal to the coming out of Egypt of 40 years. And Baha'u'llah received his revelation from God in 1852, and he passed away in Israel in 1892. Exactly 40 years. So as you can see, Baha'u'llah very emphatically and specifically fulfills the prophecies found in the 7th chapter of the book of Micah. Getting back to the book of Isaiah and the references there to Mount Carmel, let me digress one more time. There is another reference in another place to the Messiah coming to Mount Carmel. In the book of Revelation, it says that the great conflict which will rage around the Messiah in the last days will take place at Armageddon. Now in the Hebrew language, the word for mountain is Har, and the word Megiddon refers to the city of Megiddo, the Israeli city of Megiddo. In other words, the word Armageddon literally means the mountain of Megiddo. Now the city of Megiddo is located just a few miles inland from the city of Akka. And the mountain, which is located right next to the city of Megiddo, is Mount Carmel. In other words, Mount Carmel is the Armageddon. Mount Carmel is the mountain of Megiddo. And according to the book of Revelation, and to Isaiah, and to Micah, the mountain of Megiddo, Mount Carmel, is the place where the Messiah is supposed to appear. Now in Islam, there is a 1,300-year-old prophecy which reads, quote, "Ere long, God will shine from the face of the glory of the most glorious with the name of Baha on the day of Absolute in the plain of Akka." According to this prophecy, the promised one will come to the plain of Akka, and his new name will be Baha. How much more explicit can you get? His name was Baha, and he was sent to Akka involuntarily as a prisoner. Now the word Baha means glory, And you may have noticed the repeated references to the glory of God or to the glory of the Father in the prophecies. For example, Jesus said that the Messiah, quote, "the Son of Man, shall come in the glory of his Father. Then he shall reward every man according to his works," unquote. This is Matthew 16. So the Son of Man shall come in the glory of God, the glory of his Father. And according to these prophecies, the promised one, with the new name of Baha, will come to Akka, Mount Carmel, and the plain of Sharon. And Baha'u'llah very specifically did that. Now, the city of Akka, in the middle of the 1800s, at the time when the Jews began to return to Israel, the city of Akka at this time was the most desolate prison of the Turkish Ottoman Empire. The entire city at this time was a prison. And life in this prison was so disease-infested and so harsh that there was a saying back then that a bird who flew over Akka would die. Now likewise, people who were sent to this hellhole usually also died. And this is the city where Isaiah said that the Messiah would come. And apparently he was saying that the Messiah would come as a prisoner. Now Isaiah spoke of the people who will oppose the Messiah when he appears. Isaiah wrote, "Woe to the rebellious children that take counsel but not of me. This is a rebellious people, lying children, children that will not hear the law of the Lord, which say, Prophesy not unto us right things, speak unto us smooth things, prophesy deceits. Get you out of the way, cause the Holy One of Israel to cease from before us." This is the people at the time of the appearance of the Messiah. This is in Isaiah 30. The people of Baha'u'llah's day caused the, quote, Holy One of Israel to cease from before them by sending him to the prison city of Akka. Isaiah wrote of the treatment that the Messiah will receive in this prison. Isaiah wrote, quote, "Many were astonished at him. His visage was so marred." Isaiah 52. In another place, Isaiah said, "He is despised and rejected of men. He was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities. He was taken from prison, from Akka, for he was cut off out of the land of the living. Thou shalt make his soul an offering for sin. He shall see his seed, and God shall prolong his days." Isaiah 53. According to these passages from Isaiah, Isaiah says that the Messiah will suffer greatly in prison, so greatly that his friends and family will be astonished by his bruises, his wounds, and his marred appearance. And Isaiah ends this section by promising that despite his sufferings, the Messiah will live to see his children, and that God will prolong his days, that the Messiah will have a long life. That's all the time I have on this side of the tape. So if you don't mind, I'm going to continue on the next side. So please come back. Please come back. And I will finish this commentary on the book of Isaiah and Baha'u'llah's fulfillment of the prophecies of Isaiah. Welcome back. This is a continuation of the prophecies that Baha'u'llah fulfilled from the book of Isaiah. Now, Isaiah next promises that when the Messiah comes, he will not only renew religion, but he will reveal new things. Isaiah wrote, quote, "The former things are come to pass, and new things do I declare. Sing unto the Lord a new song, and he will magnify the law and make it honorable. I will do a new thing. Shall ye not know it?" This is Isaiah 42:3. "The former things are come to pass, the new things do I declare. Sing unto the Lord a new song. He shall magnify the law, make it honorable." Then he says, "I will do a new thing. Shall ye not know it?" This is Isaiah 42 and 43. Jesus foretold that a new Jerusalem would come. And here Isaiah was saying that when the Messiah appears, he will do new things. The prophet Daniel wrote that the books are sealed until the time of the end, at which time the Messiah will come to unseal them. And then once again in the book of Revelation we find a similar scene where John describes the Messiah opening a scroll sealed with 7 seals. And Baha'u'llah has done this. He has come, he has brought us new teachings. Isaiah continues by telling us something about these teachings. He tells us that the new era, which will be ushered in by the Messiah, will on one hand be characterized by turmoil, by upheaval, by wars and great suffering. But on the other hand, Isaiah also promises that these birth pangs will culminate in a world where, quote, "Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore." This is Isaiah 2. Isaiah speaks of the people who formerly were asleep and dead, saying, "The people that walked in darkness have seen a great light. For unto us a child is born, and his name shall be called the Everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace. And the government shall be upon his shoulder. Of the increase of his government and peace there shall be no end." Isaiah 9. Does Baha'u'llah fulfill this prophecy? Has Baha'u'llah brought a new government? The answer, once again, is yes. Now at the end of his book, Isaiah tells us what the eventual goal of the religion of God is. He says, quote, "Behold, I create a new heavens and a new earth, and the former things shall not be remembered, nor come to mind." This is Isaiah 65. And again he says, "I will gather all nations and tongues, and they shall come and see my glory. All flesh shall come to worship before thee." This is Isaiah 66, in the very last chapter. All nations and tongues will come, all flesh shall come to worship before thee. And this will be a time when war will cease, and a government will come which will increase to encircle the entire earth. Now, Baha'u'llah does very specifically claim to be the one foretold by Isaiah. Baha'u'llah wrote, quote, "I am the one whom the tongue of Isaiah hath extolled, the one with whose name both the Torah, the Old Testament, and the Evangel, the New Testament, the one with whose name both the Torah and the Evangel were adorned." Now, although the book of Isaiah was written over 2,600 years ago, it clearly foretells the life and teachings of Baha'u'llah. And here Baha'u'llah very clearly says, "I am the one whom the tongue of Isaiah hath extolled." Now Baha'u'llah very literally fulfills each and every one of the prophecies given by Isaiah. Baha'u'llah came with a new name. Baha'u'llah's name in English means the glory of God. Baha'u'llah's people are called by a new name. They are called Baha'i, or followers of Baha. Baha'u'llah was born to the east of Israel, in the land of Persia. He is a member of one of the oldest royal families of Persia, and he's descended from the Sasanian dynasty of Persian kings, as foretold by Zoroaster. Baha'u'llah also is a direct descendant of Abraham and Jesse, the father of King David. Baha'u'llah was royalty. Baha'u'llah was literally a prince, the Prince of Peace. Now, how does this story relate to the book of Revelation and to the book of Daniel? We have seen that in the book of Revelation and the book of Daniel, both of these books foretell the coming of a beast who opposes the people of God. And it has been demonstrated that in the past, this was an extremely destructive element which had arisen within the religion of Islam. And by the time that Baha'u'llah appeared, the clergy and the government leaders which in one sense are the beasts of the book of Revelation, became Baha'u'llah's worst enemies. They despised him, and they conspired to destroy Baha'u'llah. Now, even though Baha'u'llah had committed no crime, his enemies had him arrested. He was beaten until he was bruised and bloody, and he was thrown into an underground prison almost unimaginable in its disgusting circumstances. This prison was dark, it was cold, it was vermin infested, and it had no sanitary facilities. Now, his enemies also placed Baha'u'llah in special chains, which were reserved for the worst criminals of the realm. Now, these chains weighed over 100 pounds apiece, and they cut deeply into Baha'u'llah's shoulders and neck, and they scarred him for life. Now, Baha'u'llah's health deteriorated so much in the dungeon that he almost died. And his visage, as Isaiah said, was so marred that even his young son had difficulty recognizing him when he saw him. Now, the Islamic clergy had decreed that membership in Baha'u'llah's new religion was a crime punishable by death. And the Islamic clergy and government leaders not only conspired to kill the Bab, the forerunner of Baha'u'llah, but they eventually killed more than 20,000 innocent believers. Many were put to death in the most fiendishly imaginative ways. And yet, despite these persecutions, Baha'u'llah's fame increased, and this new religion continued to grow. So next, Baha'u'llah's enemies, in an attempt to limit his growing popularity, his enemies exiled him away from his home country. Baha'u'llah was forced to travel over 3,000 miles on these exiles. And his enemies eventually sent him to the most foul and desolate prison in the Ottoman Empire. They sent him to the prison city of Akka in Israel. Now, it was the hope of his enemies that Baha'u'llah would die in this horrible prison, and that he would be forgotten. But instead, by sending Baha'u'llah to Israel, and by sending Baha'u'llah to Akka, his enemies actually unknowingly fulfilled the ancient Bible prophecies of Isaiah and the other prophets. Baha'u'llah, the glory of God, came to Israel from the east, involuntarily as a prisoner and an exile. Now, life in the prison city of Akka was extremely harsh. Baha'u'llah's young son and several of Baha'u'llah's companions actually died from the conditions of Akka. And Baha'u'llah himself, too, suffered terribly. And at times, it seemed that he, too, would perish. Now this, however, was not to happen. After all, if you recall, Isaiah had promised that the Messiah would endure these hardships. He would come out of the prison. He would live to see his seed, his children, and he would live to an old age. Now, after spending years in Akka, Baha'u'llah did eventually come out of this prison. It was then that he and his children then pitched his tent on the side of Mount Carmel, overlooking Akka to the north and the plain of Sharon to the south. Now, Baha'u'llah spent the rest of his 40-year-long ministry as a prisoner near Akka. So as you can see, as Isaiah promised, God prolonged Baha'u'llah's days. He did come out of the prison, and he did live to see his seed, his children. Baha'u'llah eventually lived to be 75 years old. And it was from the prison of Akka that Baha'u'llah wrote the new teachings that, as Isaiah said, magnify the law and make it honorable. And Baha'u'llah also has created the new government whose increase will see no end, as promised by Isaiah. the supreme governing body of Baha'u'llah's New World Order, is called the Universal House of Justice. Now, when we compare the prophecies of Isaiah to the life story and to the teachings of Baha'u'llah, we can see that Baha'u'llah very clearly fulfills each and every one of the prophecies given to us by Isaiah. Now this brings us full circle to the first prophecy that we mentioned at the beginning of this presentation. The Hebrew prophet Ezekiel, speaking of the Messiah, said, quote, "Thou shalt bear the iniquity of the house of Judah 40 days. I have appointed thee each day for a year." Ezekiel 4:6. This is the day for a year statement from Ezekiel. Now, using the day for a year principle again, we know that the 40 days actually are 40 years. In other words, Ezekiel is saying that the Messiah will, quote, "bear the iniquity of the house of Judah," unquote, for 40 years. The Jewish rabbinical scholar Theodore Gaster, in his book The Dead Sea Scrolls, gives us an even clearer picture of this 40-year prophecy. Rabbi Gaster says, quote, "The war against Gog and Magog, the beast, would mark the end of the present era of wickedness, but not the end of the world. It would last 40 years, the period of so-called messianic travail, and would pave the way for the era of divine favor." Now these prophecies, once again, were fulfilled by Baha'u'llah. Baha'u'llah suffered exile and imprisonment at the hands of the Islamic clergy for 40 years. His sufferings have ushered in this new era of divine favor and progress. Now, virtually every area of human life has been transformed since Baha'u'llah appeared. Look at what life was like 150 years ago. And then consider the tremendous advances in the world since then. It's obvious that a completely new era in the history of humanity has dawned. This is the long-awaited era of divine favor, which will gradually see the establishment of the universal peace which was foretold by Isaiah. Now, the story of the conflict between the beast and the Son of Man, the Islamic beast and the Baha'i faith, still continues today. Now, the Baha'i faith is the only non-Islamic religion ever to show significant growth in an Islamic country. And despite ferocious opposition, the Baha'i faith has grown to become the second largest religion of Iran, which is ancient Persia. Now, when the Islamic government of Iran seized power in 1979, they once again launched a concerted campaign to destroy the Persian Baha'i community. But when the Baha'is of Iran refused to convert to the religion of Ayatollah Khomeini, thousands of these innocent people were either executed, murdered, abducted, or imprisoned. Their property was confiscated, and they were no longer allowed to hold jobs. They were not even allowed to leave the country. Now, when an appeal for mercy was received from the President of the United States, the Islamic government of Iran responded by executing 10 more Baha'i women and young girls. In order to induce the greatest amount of terror, these young women were hanged one at a time while the others watched. The youngest Baha'i executed was a 15-year-old high school girl. Now, the human rights group Amnesty International has called this persecution of the Iranian Baha'i community the most serious human rights violation on earth. And the sufferings of the Baha'is of Iran still continues today, despite appeals from the governments of the civilized countries of the world. Now, the Islamic beast is still determined to destroy the Baha'i faith. Now, Jesus taught that, quote, "Ye shall know them by their fruits." And anyone who has recently read the newspapers or watch the news on TV can easily see the fruits of the Islamic beast. What are the fruits of the Baha'i faith? What did Baha'u'llah teach? Jesus said that false prophets will arise. But then he said, the way that you can tell a true prophet from a false prophet is by their fruits. What is Baha'u'llah's fruits? What did Baha'u'llah teach? Baha'u'llah said, quote, "We desire but the good of the world and the happiness of the nations. Yet they deem us a stirrer up of strife and sedition, worthy of bondage and banishment. That all nations should become one in faith, and all men as brothers. That the bonds of affection and unity between the sons of men should be strengthened. That diversity of religion should cease, and differences of race be annulled. What harm is there in this? Yet so it shall be. These fruitless strifes, these ruinous wars shall pass away, and the most great peace shall come." Unquote. The central teachings of the Baha'i faith are the oneness of God, the oneness of religion, and the oneness of humanity. Baha'u'llah teaches that divine revelation is an ongoing and progressive process. He affirms that all the great religions of the world are divine in origin, and that they represent successive stages in the spiritual evolution of human society. Now, the teachings of Baha'u'llah revitalize the essential verities revealed by each former messenger. And in addition, he has revealed new teachings which satisfy the needs of the world in this new era. Now, some of these new principles include the elimination of prejudices of all kinds, with special emphasis on the elimination of racial prejudice, the independent search for truth, the equality of men and women, the essential harmony of science and religion, the need for universal compulsory education for children, the need for a universal auxiliary language, a second language which the people of the world can learn, a spiritual solution to economic problems, the elimination of extremes of wealth and poverty, and the protection of cultural diversity. Now, according to the Encyclopedia Britannica, Baha'i is one of the most widespread and diverse religious groups on earth today. Britannica states, quote, "Over 14 major religious systems are each now found in over 80 countries. Christianity, Islam, and the Baha'i world faith are the most global." Unquote. Now, however, unlike the other religions, the Baha'i faith has never split. The Baha'i faith is never split up into sects or denominations. The Baha'i faith is still unified. The Baha'i faith has demonstrated its ability to attract members from every culture and religion. And today, the Baha'i international community is a cross-section of humanity living in more than 125,000 locations in over 340 countries and territories. These figures are probably obsolete by now. The Baha'i faith is growing so rapidly. The Baha'i faith includes over 2,100 races, nationalities, tribes, and ethnic groups. And Baha'i literature is translated into almost 800 languages and dialects. Now, the promise that peace will come was given by the Hebrew prophet Isaiah. Isaiah said, "It shall come to pass in the last days that the Lord's house shall be established in the top of the mountains, and all nations shall flow unto it. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war any more." This is in Isaiah 2. in Isaiah 9, he says, "And the government shall be upon his shoulder." The government shall be upon the Messiah's shoulder. "Of the increase of his government and peace, there shall be no end." The government will increase until it encompasses the entire earth. Now, Baha'u'llah, the promised one, foretold in the prophecies of Isaiah, has established this government. Baha'u'llah's government is democratically elected, and it exists today at the local, national, and world levels. The world head of Baha'u'llah's government is the 9-member Universal House of Justice. Now, the Baha'i World Center resides on the site of Mount Carmel, the holy mountain in Israel, as promised by Isaiah. And the Baha'i writings describe the Universal House of Justice as, quote, "the sole refuge of a tottering civilization," unquote. Now, this house, the Universal House of Justice, was created by Baha'u'llah and has been charged by him with the responsibility to establish the peace promised by Isaiah. Baha'u'llah wrote, quote, "It is incumbent upon the ministers of the House of Justice to promote the lesser peace. This matter is imperative and absolutely essential," unquote. Now, in response to this Great Commission, the Universal House of Justice recently issued a call to the peoples of the world in a letter titled "The Promise of World Peace." This letter begins, quote, "The great peace towards which people of goodwill throughout the centuries have inclined their hearts, of which seers and poets for countless generations have expressed their vision, and for which, from age to age, the sacred scriptures of mankind have constantly held the promise. This peace is now at long last within the reach of the nations. World peace is not only possible, but inevitable. Now, whether peace is to be reached only after unimaginable horrors precipitated by humanity's stubborn clinging to old patterns of behavior, or is to be embraced by an act of consultative will, is the choice before all who inhabit the earth," unquote. Now, the promise of world peace identifies the favorable signs for peace. It defines the role of religion as the source of order and examines the root causes of war. It lists some of the primary obstacles to peace, such as racism, the inordinate disparity between rich and poor, unbridled nationalism, and the lack of full equality between the sexes. It states that world order can be founded only on a consciousness of the oneness of mankind, and it offers the Baha'i world community as a model of the unity necessary for peace. Finally, the promise of world peace calls for the holding of a, quote, "mighty convocation," unquote, of the leaders of all nations that will lay the foundations of universal peace. When Jesus first appeared 2,000 years ago, the excited news went out, quote, "We have found him whose coming was foretold in the Scriptures," unquote. Now, this statement was immediately met by an objection, by a skeptical remark. And all Baha'is ask you to do is to examine the proofs of Baha'u'llah, to examine his teachings, and then to decide whether this story is true, to decide if Baha'u'llah truly is the promised one, to decide whether Baha'u'llah truly is from God. Now, Jesus tried to prepare his followers to recognize the coming of his Father's kingdom. And that's why he taught us to pray, "Our Father, which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven." This prayer is found in Matthew 6:9. Now, this is one of the ultimate goals of Christianity, to recognize the coming of the kingdom. Now, Jesus knew that this would be difficult, and that's why he gave us so many prophecies to show us the way. Jesus hoped that we would have the ability to recognize the fulfillment of these prophecies so that we could help build the kingdom of his Father. In another place, Jesus said, quote, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man cometh to the Father but by me." This is found in John 14:6. Now to this statement, Baha'u'llah joyfully replies, quote, "Lo, the Father is come. Lo, the Father is come, and that which you were promised in the kingdom is fulfilled. This is the word which the Son, Jesus, concealed, when to those around him he said, Ye cannot bear it now. Beware, O followers of the Son, that ye cast it not behind your backs. Take ye fast hold of it. Better is this for you than all that ye possess. This is that which the Son hath decreed, and whatsoever hath proceeded out of his blameless, his truth-speaking mouth, can never be altered." Now, we have conclusively shown in this presentation that the mysterious Bible numbers and their corresponding prophecies have repeatedly foretold the appearance of Baha'u'llah and the Baha'i faith. The promised one has come, and the unity and well-being of the entire human family is the purpose of his revelation. Now, the Baha'i international community offers itself as an example that the lofty goals and objectives set by Baha'u'llah can be achieved, and that peace is possible. The Baha'i faith helps us to understand the processes that are reshaping the world, and it gives us hope that there are workable solutions to the problems that threaten humanity. Now, you may or may not have heard this extraordinary story before, and the Baha'is only ask you to do one thing. We ask you to examine the proofs and then to decide objectively whether this exciting story is true. Now, if you do find that it is true, then we invite you to join with us, hand in hand, as we build the Christ promise, Kingdom of God on earth. Now, in conclusion, Baha'u'llah states, "I bear witness, O friends, that the favor is complete, the argument fulfilled, the proof manifest, and the evidence established. Let it now be seen what your endeavors and the path of detachment will reveal. In this wise hath the divine favor been fully vouchsafed unto you, and unto them that are in heaven and on earth. All praise to God, the Lord of all worlds." I would like to thank you for listening to this presentation, and I would like to bring this presentation to a close with a quote from the prophet Isaiah. Isaiah wrote, quote, "The former things are come to pass, and new things do I declare. Sing unto the Lord a new song. He will magnify the law and make it honorable. I will do a new thing. Shall ye not know it? Shall ye not know it?" We Baha'is invite you to learn more about Baha'u'llah, to learn more about the Baha'i faith. And if you do decide that it is true, that it is from God, then we invite you to join with us as we